All right, as we begin chapter 4, I want to remind you of something. So in chapter 1, we learned about what anatomy and physiology is all about. In chapter 2, we looked at atoms and ions and molecules, what they are and how they build things that result in structures of the human body. In chapter 3, we talked about the energy and the chemical reactions and cell respiration, all of which, of course, play a role in providing the energy that a human body needs to be alive. So everything that we've talked about so far is laying a foundation. Think about if you're going to build a house. You can't just go out somewhere on a piece of ground and start putting up walls. You can't put a roof up until you build walls. But before you build walls, you've got to lay a foundation. Okay, so that's sort of what we're doing with these introductory chapters in the first unit. We're building a foundation for a discussion about the human body. So we've got to clear the ground. We've got to pour the concrete. We've got to prepare the foundation and make it nice and smooth and level so that we can build upon that and put our house up. Well, that's exactly what we're doing with these first few chapters. We're laying the foundation for you to build more knowledge about the human body. So be patient. Know all of this intro stuff is going to pay off because we're going to be moving into a study of tissues and then organs and organ systems. So let's get rocking on chapter 4. Remember back in chapter 1, we talked about the levels of organization, and we started with the atoms, which can form chemical bonds and form molecules. Then molecules can assemble into big macromolecules like proteins and DNA. Those macromolecules can be components of organelles, small organs that are found within cells that have a specific job to do. So organelles are found in cells. Cells with a common origin and function form tissues. Tissues form organs. Organs are part of organ systems, and organ systems make up the organism, in our case, the human body. In this chapter, we're going to talk about these cells. So body processes are dependent on cells and the activities that they do, the role that they play in the human body. For this reason, cells are called the functional unit of the body. They're the smallest structure to exhibit all of those characteristics of life that we talked about back in chapter 1 again. Cytology is the study of cells. Cytos means a hollow place or a cell. Now, because most cells are extremely small, we have to use microscopy, using a microscope, to visualize the things that are too small for the naked eye to see. In these images you see at the top, you have the same structures, cilia, which are little projections off the cell surface. You see how they appear using 3 different types of microscopes. The one that's used most commonly in academic labs, especially at our level to study anatomy and physiology, is the light microscope. So the image you see here on the far left, this is how cilia appears in our labs using light microscopes. Now, the TEM, the transmission electron microscopy, or the scanning electron microscopy, as you see here, TEM and SEM, we can't afford those guys. Those are really expensive, and they really wouldn't serve our purpose for learning the basics about structure and function of this basic unit of life we call the cell. Now, there are over 200 different types of cells in the human body, but there are approximately 75 trillion total cells in an adult human. Most cells are microscopic, but some are large enough to be just barely big enough to be visualized with the human eye. So, for instance, your red blood cells are extremely small. Just to give you an idea of how small they are, you could put approximately 5 million erythrocytes. That's the science name for red blood cells. You could put 5 million of those on the head of a pin. You know, like the pins that Granny uses to hold your pant leg up until she hems them. Yeah, imagine 5 million cells in that teeny tiny little drop of blood. Now, in contrast, the human oocyte, the egg that the females make in the ovaries, that one most of the time is large enough to be visualized, but it's still extremely small. We're going to learn about a lot of these different types of cells and how to characterize them or classify them based on their shape and the number of layers. But when we're talking about physiology, remember form and function. These cells have a specific job to do, and they do that job based on several things, including their anatomy. If you look at the top of this image up here, this is a neuron, which is a nerve cell. Now, it's got these little pokey things up here. That's going to be your receivers. They get information, then the cell body processes it and fires a nerve impulse down this long structure right here so that this cell can stimulate other cells. Pretty cool shape to do the job it needs to do. Your red blood cells are biconcave disc. I sort of think of this like if you've got some of those canned biscuits, you know, and you take them out of the container and they're squishy and you can smash them. So if you put your fingers on each side of that biscuit dough and you smash it, well, you're creating a biconcave surface or an indentation on the top and the bottom. So that's the way your red blood cells are. That shape allows them to carry more oxygen because it increases the surface area. So as we continue to learn about these cells that make up the structures in the human body, keep those things in mind. Look at the shape of the cells. How are they composed? What do they contain within them? And all of that allows them to do the job that they need to do. On the right side of this image, you see just some comparative sizes, starting with the entire human body. Some of your muscle cells and nerve cells can be extremely long, up to 1 meter long. Isn't that crazy? Yeah, right? And then, of course, we continue to get smaller and smaller. Here we have the human oocyte or egg cell, and it's right there on the border of what we can see with the unassisted eye, so without a microscope. Here in the yellow, the things that you must have a microscope to see, and then things that are even smaller that we have to have one of those really powerful microscopes. In my many, many years of teaching these courses, I've looked at a whole lot of textbooks, probably hundreds, if not 1,000 or more. Every single one of them, when we get to the chapter on cell, has an image that looks almost identical to this one. The reason for that is this is not a real human cell. This is a generalized cell that's created to show all of the components that you would find in or on associated with a cell. So we use this generalized image, but now remember, this is not a true cell that you would find in the human body. But regardless what cell we're referring to, there are 3 features that are found in all human cells. Those include the plasma membrane, which is also called the cell membrane. It forms the outer barrier that separates the internal contents of the cell from the stuff outside of the cell. So it regulates what gets in and out. Okay? Now, it's just like your skin. Your skin is a membrane. It separates the outside environment from your internal environment. Your cell membrane does the same thing. So the stuff inside the cell we call intracellular. Stuff outside the cell is extracellular. So the cell membrane separates the intracellular fluid from the extracellular fluid. That extracellular fluid is also referred to as interstitial fluid, which means tissue fluid. The second component of all cells is the nucleus. So the nucleus is the largest structure found within all of our cells, and it's enclosed by something called the nuclear envelope. So it's really just like another membrane inside the cell. So that nuclear envelope is composed of phospholipids, just like the cell membrane, but it surrounds and contains the DNA, which is found in the nucleus. Now, in addition to that, we have the nucleolus, which is a dark staining area within there, and the fluid within the nucleus called the neoplasm. Now, don't panic, guys. We're going to look at each of these structures individually. Right now, we're just doing a general overview of the three common components found in all cells. The cytoplasm is a generalized term that refers to all of the contents located between the cell membrane and the nucleus. So basically, it's everything inside except the nucleus, okay? So there are three major components in the cytoplasm. The cytosol is the liquid, so it's sort of this pale little almost purpley gray colored stuff you see in here. Think of it like a water balloon, and that would be your water. Okay, now in addition to that, we have organelles. So that's all of these large structures you see. And then we have something called inclusions. I like to think of that as just things that the cell needs. So they're included in the cytoplasm. Now again, we're going to elaborate on all of this as we continue through this chapter. Let's take a quick look at these things found within the cytoplasm before we move on. So the cytosol, remember, is also called the intracellular fluid. It's a very thick or viscous, syrupy-like fluid that is found within the cytoplasm, or helps to make up the liquidy part of the cytoplasm, to be more correct. It has a very high water content, but it also contains a lot of dissolved macromolecules that include carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, even smaller molecules like glucose and amino acids. The cytosol also contains a lot of ions like potassium and phosphate. Organelles are larger structures found within the cell. Organelle, small organ. E-L-L-E means small. Okay? So these are organized structures within the cells that have unique characteristic shape and function. We have two major categories of organelles, membrane-bound and non-membrane-bound. That simply means whether or not they are surrounded by a membrane, just like the cell membrane. That membrane separates the organelle's contents from the cytosol so that the activities that organelle needs to do can go ahead and do its job, or proceed without disruption from other cellular activities. So again, it forms a barrier so that what that organelle needs to do, it can do so uninterrupted by anything else within the cell. The cytosol also has some temporary little structures we call inclusions. So inclusions are not really organelles or structures, but they're just aggregates or clusters of a particular type of molecule. So we're continuously adding molecules and removing molecules, and the inclusions, of course, are those molecules. So things like pigments that give color to your skin and your hair and your eyes, or nutrients like glycogen that we store in the liver, or some of the triglycerides that we store in adipose tissue. Those are cellular inclusions. Some of the very basic generalized functions of the cell depend on the shape of that cell and what it contains. So in order for a cell to maintain its integrity, to be able to do what it needs to do, and the shape of the cell, well, that's going to depend on the membrane that covers it and the stuff that's inside. I mean, think about a balloon. If you fill it with water, it's going to just fill up to be sort of a big circle, right? Like a ball. But what if you fill it with marbles? It's going to be lumpy and bumpy. What if you put bricks in it? Well, boy, that would be difficult. Maybe something different. What if you put oranges in it? Okay, so the contents help to determine the shape and the integrity of the cell. In addition to that, cells have to be able to harvest energy from the nutrients and the chemical building blocks available in the body. Now, cells have metabolic processes going on, so they have to be able to get rid of their waste products so that they don't build up and interfere with the activity of the cell. And most cells, there are a few exceptions in the human body, most cells are capable of something called cell division. It's basically If you want to think of it in its most simplistic form, think of it as cellular cloning. One cell replicates everything within itself and makes two genetically identical copies that do the same job of the original cell. For instance, a cell in the pancreas that makes insulin, when it does cell division, and actually that process is called mitosis, you're going to hear that soon. When that cell in the pancreas that makes insulin undergoes mitosis, it replicates everything within the cell, including the DNA, then separates into two cells that go right back to making insulin in the pancreas, just like the original cell.